Hi, welcome back to the recap videos for the beliefs about Jesus, specifically the Christian beliefs about Jesus. Last lesson we looked at the incarnation, how Jesus was God made flesh on earth. Today we're going to be looking specifically at the crucifixion of Jesus. And more specifically, we're going to be understanding the impact of the crucifixion on Christians today. What Christians believe about it, how it impacts their faith, and why it's such a significant event in Christian history. Three key words that we're going to be focusing on throughout today's lesson is crucifixion, forgiveness, and suffering. Now, by the end of the lesson, you should have a good understanding of what these mean and why they are important to Christians. So, remember back to our starter, I asked you to, using your knowledge of the Christian story, explain this picture here. We've got a picture of the crucifixion, or a stylized picture of the crucifixion. I asked you to tell me who's involved, what's happening, and why this is happening. Now, obviously, we've got Jesus the central figure being crucified himself. Around him, we have his followers, women who are his followers, weeping, lamenting the fact that Jesus has been killed. This was a tragedy. Why is this happening? Well, as we spoke about earlier, Jesus was cautioning his followers not to refer to him as the Christ, as the Son of God, as he worried that he would be arrested and punished and executed for blasphemy. Now, this is indeed what eventually happened. Pontius Pilate, the then Roman governor, was persuaded to arrest Jesus and to prosecute him for blasphemy. And the punishment for this at the time was crucifixion. This is obviously not the only artistic interpretation of the crucifixion, being that the crucifixion is one of the most important aspects of Christian belief, and it's one of the most important stories that they tell. It's unsurprising that there's been an absolute ton of Christian devotional art focusing on the crucifixion and the crucifixion narrative. This is just one that I found to get you to have a look at. So you may have seen different examples of it, and throughout today's lesson you're going to see a couple more artistic interpretations of it. Bear in mind, none of these are photographs, none of these are documentary evidence. These are just artistic interpretations, often done by people who believe in the importance of the Christian narrative. So very often you see prophetic images and you see things that complement the idea that Jesus is in fact God and that his crucifixion was so important in these works of art. So it's important to bear that in mind going forward. Now, crucifixion in Roman times was not a particularly exclusive punishment. Lots and lots of people were crucified. It was very, very common punishment for people within the Roman Empire. Now, bear in mind, at the time that Jesus was around, the Roman Empire dominated most of the world at the time. Well, most of the known world anyway. And this form of punishment was one which they used regularly. What would happen would be a condemned criminal would be nailed to a cross until they died. Simple as that. Now, absolutely horrendous. It could take up to 3 days to die, so it wasn't a quick punishment. And before this, what would happen would be that you would be scourged, which meant that you'd be whipped, you would be beaten, and very often this beating was so severe that people would die just from this alone, that people's entrails would be hanging out, that people's flesh would be almost entirely peeled from their body. This was an absolutely barbaric and horrendous form of capital punishment. After this, if you survived your scourging, you would be forced to carry the crossbeam, the thing that your arms would be nailed to the place of execution. Now, if you look at the picture that I've put on the slide here, very often in depictions of the Passion, which is what we call the story of Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus is seen to be carrying the entire cross. Now, we don't necessarily know 100%, but historians suggest that perhaps the vertical beam would have been there permanently and that the condemned would only have had to carry the crossbeam. Very often in devotional art, you see Jesus carrying the whole cross. This is an extract from The Passion of the Christ, which is a particularly brutal and gory film, which depicts just that, the Passion of the Christ, the crucifixion story. So if you see images of Jesus carrying the whole cross, that's just a common misconception, or a historical disagreement. Once Jesus was at the point of execution, his clothing would have been removed, and nails would have been hammered through his wrists, in between the radius and ulna, and through the heel bone. Now, it's a common misconception that crucifixion victims had their hands nailed to the cross. Now, the hand isn't actually capable of supporting the body weight, and therefore would just rip through and tear through. So Romans, they would have crucified you through the wrists, because that's enough to support you. Common misconception, again, very often it's seen in devotional art that there's holes in the hands. This is just a misunderstanding of the history. Then leg bones were smashed, so you'd have your leg bone smashed to speed up the death. So this would force the body to slump downwards, and eventually your lungs would fill up with fluid and you would be suffocated. So very often, if you'd been hanging there for too long, they'd smash your leg bones just to speed up the process. Now, Jesus' death, however, was very, very quick, because he'd been severely scourged before he was crucified. Now, this happened to most crucifixion victims, but his was particularly bad. He'd lost a lot of blood, and therefore he died very, very quickly on the cross. Now, whilst Jesus' death was particularly quick, due to the severity of his scourging, as I said previously, it could take up to 3 days for somebody to die on the cross. This was a very, very slow way of torturing people to death. So normally what would happen would be, after the death, the body of the condemned man would be left on the cross as a warning to other people. Now, as with most forms of execution in the ancient world, these were done in the most public way possible, as a deterrent for other people committing crime. Justice, if you want to call it that, during that period of history, was very much about instilling fear in the populace. So leaving the decaying corpse on the cross would be a way of warning other people not to commit the same crime. However, rather than Jesus' body being left up on the cross, his followers asked if they could bury him quickly, before the start of the Sabbath, when they could do no work. And they were granted this request. Jesus' body was then buried in a tomb. So that was just a brief summary of the story of Jesus' death, the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and the timeline of what happened. This is one of the most important stories in Christianity. However, his death isn't a particularly spectacular one. To be crucified in the Roman Empire wasn't a significant way to die. Crucifixion has subsequently become significant as a result of Christianity, but at the time it was a particularly common way to die. Slaves, in fact, were very often crucified. It wasn't a particularly glorious way to die, and it wasn't particularly notable. What is notable, however, and what is important, are the stories of the significance of the crucifixion and what comes next. Slight spoilers for the next lesson. We're going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, where he comes back from the dead. However, the crucifixion itself is an equally important aspect of the Christian belief. So, as I said, crucifixion, when we talk about it in lessons, really has two meanings. Crucifixion, the first meaning, is simply a Roman method of execution by which criminals were fixed to a cross. And the second definition, which we use more specifically in Christianity, studies about Christianity and religion, the execution and death of Jesus on Good Friday. So the word crucifixion can mean either just simply somebody being nailed to a cross, or it can be more specifically the specific execution and death of Jesus Christ on Good Friday. So one of the most detailed stories from the whole of Jesus' life is the account of how he died. He was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate, who was the then Roman governor, and his death was to be by crucifixion. So even though Christians believe that Jesus was the Son of God, it does not mean that he was in any way spared the pain and horror of his crucifixion. Remember, with the incarnation, we looked at how Jesus was not only fully God, but he was also fully human. And we looked at the human emotions, the human feelings, and the human bodily functions that Jesus had. Jesus also felt pain. So whilst he was being whipped, and whilst he was being scourged, and whilst he was being nailed to the cross, he would have felt the pain in exactly the same way as anyone else would have done. So according to Luke's version of the story, Jesus forgave the guards who crucified him because they did not realise the significance of what was going on. He also had conversations with the two men who were crucified with him, promising one of them that soon he would join God in paradise. Finally, though, after 6 hours on the cross, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. One of the Roman centurions in charge of the crucifixion praised God and acknowledged that Jesus had been a righteous man who had done nothing wrong, and he'd done nothing to deserve being crucified. According to Mark, in 1539, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So these two quotes about the crucifixion of Jesus, they are the two most important from the crucifixion story. Okay, I asked you to highlight them and to state why they were so important for Christians. Okay, so we're going to have a look at why they were important to Christians now. So first things first, we'll look at the shorter of the two, Mark 15:39. "Surely this man was the Son of God." Now this is important to Christians because it's showing that even somebody who was not a follower of Jesus can see that he was righteous, can see that he was the Son of God. And it could be argued that this is one of the first conversion stories. If this centurion is admitting that Jesus was the Son of God, that is a fundamental Christian belief. It also goes some way for Christians for confirming their idea that this is the Son of God. That a follower of Jesus says that he is the Son of God is not surprising. That somebody who has just punished him, sentenced him to death, admits that he is the Son of God or claims that he is the Son of God is significant. And the longer of the two, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he said this, he breathed his last. Now this is particularly important. It confirms to Christians that Jesus was who he said he was. He was the Son of God. He is speaking to his Father, God the Father, in heaven above him, and saying, "I am returning to you now. I commit my hands to your spirit." It also parallels the idea of Christians committing their spirit or trusting their spirit to God. Very often Christians refer to God as the Father or their Father or God the Father. And Christians trust God with their spirit, trust God with their eternal life. And in trusting in God, they are emulating Jesus. So these two are incredibly, incredibly important. Now you might want to look back through your books and have a look if you haven't highlighted these and if you haven't explained these. I would suggest that you do. If you're still struggling with these quotations and what their significance is, please feel free to come and see me or ask me a question down below in the comments. So we've looked at the story of the crucifixion and the way that it is told in the Gospels, but we haven't really had a chance to have a look at the impact that the crucifixion has on Christians today, the beliefs that Christians have around the crucifixion. Now, I may have mentioned that the crucifixion is probably one of the most important stories in the Gospels. It's one of the most important stories in the Christian narrative. And there's two very, very important reasons for that. So there's several ways that the crucifixion affects Christians today. The first one is that it gives them the confidence that if they accept Jesus' sacrifice, then sin can no longer destroy their lives because God forgives those who faithfully ask for forgiveness. Now, faithfully asking for forgiveness means that you genuinely, without cynicism, without any ulterior motive, ask for forgiveness from God. Now, Christians believe that God forgives those who do this. If you ask for forgiveness faithfully, you will be forgiven. And the second is that they believe that suffering is a part of life. We see it all around us, just as it was part of Jesus' life. And having also experienced it, Jesus suffered on the cross. Jesus was God. So having experienced the suffering, God understands what the sufferer is going through. So there's two key points. It confirms Christians' belief that God can forgive you, and through forgiveness we get salvation. We're going to be touching on salvation in future lessons and what that actually means. But in short, God will save us from our sin if we ask him to. If we ask him to forgive us from our sin, God will save us. And also they believe that God himself understands and has experienced suffering, and therefore understands what his people are going through, and will be more likely to respond positively if asking for forgiveness. Okay? Now please bear in mind, I've mentioned in this video and the previous video, I refer to God as a he. When we're talking about the Christian story, God is male and it is a he. So, undeniably, the crucifixion has had a massive impact on the formation of the Christian faith, and indeed on those who follow it to this day. So bearing that in mind, I ask you to have a look at this 12-mark question as an example. The death of Jesus was a great tragedy. Now, as you know, when you've received a statement like this, you are expected to evaluate it. And in that answer, you need to refer to Christian teachings, you need to give developed arguments to support your statement, you need to give developed arguments to support a different point of view, and you need to reach a justified conclusion. Now, the important thing about the justified conclusion is that you need to pick a side. It does not have to be the side that you agree with, doesn't matter. You just need to pick a side and say that it has the strongest argument. I think this is a bit strong and this is a bit strong. No, you need to be saying, yes, it was a tragedy, no, it wasn't a tragedy, and this is why. We're now going to have a look at something that you might answer this question with. So, there are good reasons to agree with this statement. Okay, so whether or not Jesus was the Son of God or not, Jesus' death was prolonged and caused great suffering. The Bible describes how he was betrayed by his friends, he was scourged, he was whipped, he was beaten, and then he was crucified before ultimately dying on the cross. This is further made worse by the fact that he was innocent of the crimes that he was accused of. He was neither a blasphemer nor a traitor. So a blasphemer is somebody who takes the Lord's name in vain or speaks out against religion. He was claiming to be the Messiah, yes, but he was, to the eye of Christians. And he wasn't a traitor either. When an innocent person is put to death such as this, it's obviously going to be described as a tragedy. That's your first point. Second point to support the statement. Furthermore, Jesus was a good example of a human being. He cared for the poor, he taught equality, and he loved to others. Christians consider his example to be an example to follow. And the death of a good person is, undeniably, a tragedy. He was also believed to be the Messiah, a figure of hope for the Jews and to his disciples, and his death must have caused great despair to them. So there we've got 2 points. We've referenced Christian teachings. Fantastic. Moving on. However, there are compelling arguments that the death of Jesus, while sad, was not a tragedy, as it led to the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and a better world. Jesus' death is considered an act of sacrifice that atoned for original sin. Original sin is the idea that humans cannot be truly good as they are corrupted by the sinful nature of Adam and Eve from the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. Even if the story of the fall is taken symbolically, so not literally, original sin is the predisposition of humans to act in a sinful way. The Bible teaches that only a human sacrifice can make up for a human sin. So Jesus' death was necessary for humans to have the potential of moral goodness. First point against the argument, with Christian teachings, fantastic. This action also restored the broken relationship between humans and God. Before, sin created a gap between humans and God, but now Jesus' death has bridged that gap. His death also provides a promise of resurrection for Christians who are now capable of living to God's high standards of moral goodness and achieving salvation. Second point against the statement, fantastic. While the human death of Jesus is sad, the arguments against the statement are more compelling. You've come to a clear conclusion. Brilliant. Whether Jesus' sacrifice there would be no atonement, humans would continue to experience original sin, and the relationship between humans and God would remain broken. Adam committed a great sin, and only a great sacrifice could atone for this. The alternative to Jesus' death is a world where original sin remains, and that would be a greater tragedy than the death of one man, however harsh that death was. Now, I don't expect you to remember this. I don't expect you to copy it down. I don't expect you to be writing it. I will be attaching it, if I can. I'll be sending a link to it. However, this is a fantastic example of a 12-mark answer. You've got your 2 points very clearly for each side. You've got reason to support this statement, point 1, reasons to support this statement, point 2, and religious teaching to support this. Then you've got reasons that go against this statement, point 1, and reasons that go against the statement, point 2, and you've also got religious teachings. Not only that, but it's all tied up very nicely with a concise and clear conclusion. Overall, I think, and it's been justified. This is an excellent, excellent answer. So, in conclusion, the crucifixion of Jesus. First of all, it was an incredibly important story within the Christian narrative. The crucifixion was the death of Jesus. It offered humanity forgiveness from sin, which again we will touch on further in our salvation recap. And it was an example of God, through Jesus, experiencing suffering. So they are your 3 key words that I spoke about at the start. These are the things that we need to be taking away from this. The story of the crucifixion is incredibly important to the Christian teachings, and it leads in very nicely to our next lesson, which we're looking at the resurrection and the ascension.